So let's look at something that we've done before, and we'll look at a couple of different things. It says given the functions, same two functions, x squared minus 3x plus 5, and then 16 minus x squared. It asks me to find the following. It asks me to find the domain of f plus g evaluated at x, and then it asks me to find the domain of f divided by g evaluated at x. All right, so first of all, f plus g of x, that's just going to be f of x plus g of x. So I've got to take those two functions and add them together. F of x we know. That's x squared minus 3x plus 5. That's f of x. Put parentheses around it for a second. Plus g of x, which we have, is 16 minus x squared. So if I take those two functions, and if I add those two functions together, then what happens is I have a positive x squared and a negative x squared. So they cancel each other out because I'm adding here. And then I have negative 3x that I can't combine with anything. So negative 3x, and then 5 plus 16 is 21. So there's f plus g of x. F plus g of x is negative 3x plus 21. And now, the question says find the domain of that function. Well, this is where you got to be able to recognize what type of function that is. That is a linear function because it's something in y equals mx plus b. So that's a linear function. And as we discussed back in 7.3, and as we're going to discuss of some on Thursday from 7.2, a linear function is just a polynomial function, and the domain of a linear function is all real numbers. So there's my domain. Now the domain is everything from negative infinity all the way to positive infinity, and that's what it asked me for. It asked me for the domain. All right, so these are going to be functions that you recognize once you do the algebra that they ask you to do. In this case, it asked me to add those two functions together. Letter F. Letter F asks me to take f divided by g of x. So that means that I have to take f of x and divide it by g of x. All right, so if I take f of x and divide it by g of x, f of x is x squared minus 3x plus 5. There's f of x. And g of x is 16 minus x squared. So g of x is 16 minus x squared there. Now, we haven't talked about this type yet. We will be one of the first things we do on Thursday, but I want to go ahead and just do this while we're here. We want to take that function, we want to find its domain. So the first thing we have to do is recognize what kind of function that is. Well, we talked about rational expressions back in chapter 6, and so if you put this in terms of function notation, it's not any different. This is a quotient of two polynomials, so this is a rational function. And if we have a rational function, then one of your questions on your test asks you to find all numbers where this rational expression is undefined. And the reason why we do that is because we have to use that here when we find domain. So the first thing we want to do is, if we want to find out what the domain of this function is, we want to find out where this function is not defined. So to find out where this function is not defined, the first thing that I have to do is I have to take my denominator and set my denominator equal to 0. So step number 1, we're going to find where it's undefined. And that we did back in chapter 6. So I take my denominator, which is 16 minus x squared. I take 16 minus x squared and I set that equal to 0. Alright, so 16 minus x squared. You can turn that around and rewrite it in descending order. You don't have to. If you keep it like it is, that's just a difference of two squares. So we can factor that and keep it just like it is. So 16 minus x squared, that's going to be 4 minus x times 4 plus x. It's turned around because it's 16 minus x squared, so I'm just writing it as I see it there. So it'll be 4 minus x times 4 plus x, difference of two squares. So I know that either 4 minus x is equal to 0. And if you take a second to solve that, you'll get that x is equal to positive 4. And if you take 4 plus x, and you set that equal to 0, take a second to solve that, you can get x is equal to negative 4. So that's the first step, is I find out where it's undefined. And the second thing that I do after I find out where it's undefined is these numbers that make my function back here undefined, those two numbers make f divided by g of x undefined. So I can't use those two values in my domain. So what I do is when I write my domain, this is how I write it every single time. My domain is all real numbers except where my function's undefined. And where my function is undefined is at x equal to 4. That's one place where it's undefined. And it's undefined at x equal to negative 4. So those are the two places where my function is undefined. So that's how you always want to write your domain. You want to write your domain of a rational function only. This is just for rational functions. The domain of a rational function is all real numbers except where your denominator is undefined. And where my denominator was undefined in this case was at positive 4 and at negative 4. All right. That is 7.3 and 7.4. You can go ahead and mark out 7.5. We're going to skip 7.5 just for the sake of time. So don't worry about doing those. Don't worry about looking at those slides or anything. We're going to omit 7.5. You're just responsible for 7.1 all the way up through 7.4. And again, like I said, we're going to finish 7.2 on Thursday, and then we're going to get into some groups, work on a worksheet over 7.3 and 7.4, and then next Tuesday we'll review for your tests. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or give me a call or stop by my office. Otherwise, I will see you all on Thursday. So just make sure you have your notes filled in with everything that I have talked through and everything that I have in, on this video here.